Today we're discussing English apocalypse manuscripts. And so we're looking now at our map of Europe. This was the part of the map that we used to help discuss pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela and the various pilgrimage routes through Spain. We also had pilgrimage routes in England, but for the moment we're going to look at England and look at some manuscripts, so some books, some illustrated books that were produced in England in the 13th and 14th centuries, so at the end of the 1200s and during the 1300s. And this is all part of what we call Gothic art. So Gothic art is kind of the last phase of medieval art after Romanesque art and through the Middle Ages. When we looked at Romanesque art, we talked a lot about drama, we talked a lot about narrative and stories, and how those illustrations and sculptures and textiles liked to illustrate really dramatic stories and to engage in a lot of storytelling. And this is more true, even more true of the Gothic period. Right now we're looking at a manuscript that we're calling the Gulbenkian Apocalypse. It's in the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, in Portugal, and it was probably made in London during the 1260s. So this is the first page of the manuscript, which again is just a book. It's written on vellum or parchment, which is animal skin that has been cleaned off, scraped, and dried under tension. And then instead of being made into the leather by tanning, it is made into parchment by chalking it. So it's more white and more of a nice surface. So what we're looking at is the first page of the Gulbenkian Apocalypse, and we're looking at what we would call a half-page miniature, or at the top of the page, we see a large historiated initial, which shows an angel talking to John, who is the author of the Apocalypse, or the Book of Revelation, telling him that what he should write in Scripture. And then we have this rather elaborate pen flourish, or marginal decoration, which involves a lot of gold, and then we have a peacock at the end here. In the medieval world, animals were symbols for different kinds of moral meanings, and they were used in stories to create different kinds of meanings. So if you've ever heard that the fox is deceptive, or that elephants are afraid of mice, that all comes from a text called the Bestiary, which is a medieval book about animals. So in the Bestiary, there is an entry on the peacock, and the peacock is a prophetic animal, it says, because it has lots of extra eyes in its wings, and so with those extra eyes, it can see the future. So there you go. That is according to the medieval knowledge about peacocks. So if we look then at the image, let's see, we've got our half-page framed miniature. We've got a little bit of the story, or the beginning of the story, as to how the Book of Revelation, or which is also called the Apocalypse, came about. We've got John, and John has been exiled to an island called Patmos, and he's asleep on the island. And you can see we have like an aerial view of the island here, and then there are other little islands around it. Then we have a ship in the sea and other fish and sea animals, sea creatures, kind of swimming around. So we've got this kind of aerial view combined with a more typical kind of profile view of, or frontal view of John, and an angel comes to visit him in a dream. And so this is the story, or the Book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse, is the story of John's dream, where an angel takes him through heaven. So this is also represented in a different way in this initial. We've got lots of gold here, gold leaf that's being used in this initial, and I apologize for the quality of the illustration here, but we've got, again, the angel telling John what to write, and John is writing on a little lectern in the way that we've seen in the form of author portraits before. Okay, and then we've got a detail of our peacock there. Okay, So then once the angel takes John to heaven, we've kind of turned the page and we see that John is asked to write 7 letters to the churches in Asia. And then he gets a vision of Christ and the 7 candlesticks. The book of Revelation is a very visual book. It's very visually exciting. And so that lends itself really well to illustration, because what the illustrators has chosen to do here is to just literally represent many of the things that are discussed in the text. And so that's kind of how we get these are the angels to the 7 churches in Asia. We've got John kneeling before Christ in the 7 candlesticks, which is an episode in this particular story, and then the angel talking to John. We get a lot of action, a lot of pointing and gesture here. That's part of how we tell the story. The angel pointing and John raising his hand is in reference to a conversation. In this particular book, there is the biblical text of Revelation, but there's also a commentary that's probably from the 12th or 13th century that tells readers what the book is all about and how to interpret the text. There are a lot of unusual signs and symbols within the text, and the commentary helps to interpret the text. This is a very special illustrated apocalypse, because not only are there illustrations for the biblical text, there are also illustrations for the commentary text. And one of the themes that we see running through this particular commentary in this particular book is the theme of anti-Semitism, or kind of an anti-Jewishness, which was a very common sentiment in the 13th century in England. Eventually, all Jews would be expelled from England in 1290, and I've argued before that this particular book is used as propaganda for the expulsion of Jews. And if we look at this particular commentary illustration, which talks about how the text in Revelation symbolizes the fall of a personification of synagogue here. She's blindfolded, her spear is broken, she's dropping the 2 tablets of the Mosaic Law, she sits on a little hill, and she sits inside a structure with a dome, probably representing the ancient world or even the Romanesque world before, and she is contrasted with Ecclesia, who is a personification of church. Ecclesia is the church in Latin. And Ecclesia sits on a nice throne. Ecclesia carries what we would call the banner of the resurrection, and Ecclesia sits in a Gothic cathedral type structure, surrounded by gold. She has a little lamb sitting on her shoulder. The lamb has a cruciform halo, and in lots of the parts of the New Testament, the lamb symbolizes Jesus Christ. Very bizarrely, in these apocalypse manuscripts of this time, we often see an image of the lamb, Christ is the lamb, bleeding from a chest wound into a chalice, which represents the cup, the communion or sacramental cup. So we've got a lot of strange imagery in these books, and that's part of the appeal of them. And then we have some Jewish elders in the middle trying to figure out whether or not they should lean towards a synagogue representing the structure of the Jewish church, or whether or not they should lean toward ecclesia representing Christianity in the 13th century. We know that they are Jewish because this figure here wears a hat with a little point on it, and that is the kind of hat that was worn by Jews in the Middle Ages. Jewish clothing was regulated by Christian documents and councils, and Jews were made to wear clothing that looked very different from the clothing that Christians wore, so that Christians would know that they were separate and other. It's also true that at this particular time, that Jews were also required to wear yellow stars on their clothing, much in the way that they were required to wear yellow stars in their clothing in Nazi Germany. Okay. So, if you know anything about the book of Revelation or the apocalypse, we have a series of horsemen that appear that help to bring about destruction. And here is an image of John being shown the first horseman by the angel.